afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you are. Welcome. We're so delighted that you're joining us for our Ecologically Just Transitions webinar today. My name is Michelle Maloney, and I'm the National Convener, and I'm delighted to be the co-founder of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, and really delighted to be hosting our webinar today with Sarah Hausman and Scott Matter. First, I'm just going to share screen because I'd like to acknowledge country, and I always like to invite people to write in the chat where you are. If that suits you, please do pop in the chat. It's become quite a nice Zoom tradition for folks to be saying hello and to let us know where you are today. So let's get things going. So yes, as I mentioned, we're really delighted to be hosting the first webinar in the newly created Ecologically Just Transitions Learning Network. And the wonderful Sarah and Scott will be telling you all about that in just a moment. I'd like to acknowledge country. I'm sure for those of you who know AELA well, this is not just lip service. We are deeply indebted to and in great admiration of the first peoples of this continent. We like to acknowledge the remarkable governance system and culture and society that cared for country and has cared for kin since time immemorial, and acknowledge that land was never ceded. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. And we pay our respects to all Indigenous folks on this call, in this country, and around the world. I particularly want to acknowledge that I live, work, and play on the truly beautiful lands of the Cubby Cubby people in southeast Queensland here. I'm just north of Brisbane. And yeah, as we often do, please pop in the chat where you're from, whose country you're on. And everything that AELA does is about a celebration of the living world. We are part of it. We're interconnected with it. If you feel like noting down in your hellos what beautiful creatures, plants, animals that you've met today, feel free to do so. It always brings a smile to the face. So I'm interested in ecologically just transitions, and I'm just going to invite Sarah and Scott to cover all of their discussion in just a moment. But one thing I wanted to note with people is, why is AELA a place for hosting this discussion? I think in a lot of ways we're a great place to host this particular line of discussion because the Just Transitions movement, which is absolutely fantastic, often focuses on the people involved in the systems change we need. So I wanted to bring up these very simple sort of definitions and thoughts before we get into the deeper discussion. The Australian Earth Laws Alliance was created 12 years ago by a group of concerned lawyers, and some of our work is inspired by Thomas Berry's work and Earth jurisprudence. This idea that the great work for human beings is to try to find our way back to some kind of peaceful or harmonious relationship with the living world, something that many cultures retained, but which industrialized and particularly colonial and imperial nation states have stripped away. This kind of lack of relationship with the living world, using nature as property, has brought us to the place where we are today. So the Just Transition movement is a framework for shifting from, correctly so, from extractive high carbon economies to sustainable low carbon ones, while trying to focus also on fairness, social equity, and economic security for workers and communities. What we often don't hear quite so much of folks talking about is that the communities aren't just the people. We have to be thinking about how do we shift from this extractive economic system we have towards something better, whilst also ensuring that the entire Earth community is cared for and protected. And it's really interesting getting a bit older in the tooth. I've been doing this kind of work now for 36 years, and in the early days, renewables were unquestionably the way forward. But in the last 10 or 15 years, we've seen, unfortunately, the powers of capitalism and industrialization do what it often does to many things: scale up positive solutions, broaden them out until they in themselves become a problem as well. So I'm personally really interested in how we have, however you want to frame it, multi-species justice, earth jurisprudence, earth laws, or rights of nature, speaking for the non-human world in this bigger space of the just transitions. So that's all I wanted to say by way of introduction. I'm absolutely thrilled and honoured that Sarah and Scott are bringing this learning network into AELA's work at the moment. It's a perfect time for us to get really serious and talk about the Just Transitions framework and the kinds of systems change we really want at a time when we are seeing so much being lost. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Scott, who I think is opening, and I'll see you at the end when I help to facilitate Q&A. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Michelle. That was a really wonderful introduction, and really appreciate you putting today's conversation in the bigger context of AELA's work. It feels like a really good fit. It feels like a good home. And I'm just not so much going to open, but invite Sarah to unmute as well. And we were going to start out with having a little bit of a conversation about where this idea came from. Sarah, can I throw over to you, and you can share a little bit about how this all started with you and I, and
For sure.
why
For
we're here
sure.
today?
Thanks, Scott. First of all, I want to say I'm joining you all from Wurundjeri country in Naarm. I'm in a little place called Eltham, and I have a beautiful Torlosa, a she oak right next to me, which I always look out the window and feel a bit of strength and grounding whenever I need it, particularly moments like this of performance. Anyway, it's wonderful to be here. The idea of the Ecologically Just Transitions Learning Network really emerged in conversations with folks at the New Economy Network Australia conference last October, I think it was. And I ran a workshop about this just transitions concept. And we had a really wonderful bunch of people, and there might be some of the people on this webinar today from that group, who really said, we need to have the ecological piece in here as well. And I found that really helpful because my focus, and I'll be talking about this shortly, so I won't go into detail now, but my focus has been on talking to communities in regional areas where they're being part of the energy transition. And of course, as volunteer groups, their energy is all about the people-to-people thing. And so to be reminded to take that space to step out, to think about the ecologically just as well as the socially just, I think is the biggest opportunity, and partly why I'm so excited by the idea of a learning network. To you, Scott.
Okay, so the only thing I want to add to that, I'm going to share a slide and say just a little bit more about where this ecologically just transitions idea came from, at least for me. So yeah, you can maybe blame me, because I think I was the one that suggested it in that workshop that you were just describing, Sarah. And one of the reasons I suggested it is because I had gotten really excited about some work coming out of the Earth Commission, which is some of the same people who do the research you might have seen on planetary boundaries. So their work is about how do we actually measure and understand how humanity can have a safe operating space where we're working within the constraints and the limitations of our planet, and also meeting the needs of humans, present and future. So what they've come up with is this Earth Systems Justice framework, and there's three pieces to it. They talk about the human side, which is our intergenerational and intragenerational justice. So are we today operating in ways that make life possible and flourishing possible for future generations? And are we operating in ways that we're not exploiting people that are alive with us today? And they add to that this idea of interspecies justice and Earth system stability. So this idea that there is no future, there is no sustainable life for humans without a well-functioning planetary system. So that's what got me really excited. And you can see in this really mediocre graphic that I whipped up that one of the ways I think about this is, so we've got transition activities and projects. And if we want to broaden our thinking about those, we start to think about just transitions. How do we make sure that they're equitable and fair for the people who are directly impacted and indirectly impacted? And then, as we do when we think from, ecological economics, for example, or other approaches, ecological approaches, we recognize that the ecological perspective is even larger than that. It encompasses the social. So we're not separate from the rest of the living planet, we're nestled within it. And when we start to recognize that, we can actually have a chance to make those more sustainable futures possible for us and for the rest of life. So I think that that's probably enough of an intro. And now, Sarah, it's your turn to share a little bit about the work that you do and where you come from in this. So you let me know when to advance slides, and I'll let you know when it's about 10 minutes.
Thanks, Scott. I think one connector I'd make before I start going through this formally is where you talked about a nested system within ecologies on Earth. I think we're at a point where there are a lot of people concerned and interested about this topic. So there's a lot of action on this already. And I want to acknowledge that Scott and I are not setting up this or initiating this learning network to be the experts. We really want to do this as a collaborative circle of people at all different places within the system of expertise engaging with the renewable energy transition. And no, you can go back to the slide, that's okay. But okay. I just really wanted to frame that and frame what our invitation to all of you, if you're interested, is to participate. We're sharing now some of the knowledge we come with, but I'm assuming there is a lot of passion and knowledge in the audience of people who are joining on the webinar and those who will come afterwards and listen to the recording.
Sarah, sorry, this is probably also a good time. I'm glad you said that because it reminded me that we wanted to mention too the sort of 12-month plan or idea that we've got with the Learning Network. And there's two parts to it. One is to host a series of discussions like this online and maybe also in person. And there is a spot on the AELA website on the Ecologically Just Transitions Learning Network page where anybody who's listening today can sign up for that and be part of it. And then the other piece is that we'd like to explore whether we can collect stories and examples with people who are doing this amazing work and pull them together into probably something like an in-house publication published under AELA to share this amazing knowledge and these experiences that people have with others who can learn from it and can use it to help progress their own work and their own projects. Okay, formalities done.
Wonderful. Okay, so I want to share the next 10 minutes talking about some of the motivations and insights that have emerged from my research in my role as Transitions Coordinator with the NED Foundation. The context is we're in the midst of a global energy transition. And this is such a profound period where we're in the midst of a very visible systems change. And after decades of extreme politicisation and resistance in Australia to renewable energy, I feel that the accelerator is now pressed flat. That has many positive elements, but there's dangers when the impetus from state and federal governments and corporate interests are to do this fast, because what often is lost when we have a top-down change that happens quickly, considering we're talking about a big systems change, is that the voices of community are not afforded the time to work with the change, to go build their trust and also be listened to. And I really want to always hold in mind that we're all on a technical and environmental learning curve here, because we're all in the process of adapting to a new future where our energy is going to be significantly created by the sun, wind and water and maybe other elements that we don't know yet. So we're in a place of unknowing. There is some chaos, there is some confusion, and yet, well, maybe because of that, the cumulative effects or impacts of this transition are not yet clear. And in many of the regional communities, excuse me, most affected by this as a place-based change, they're concerned about the possible social and environmental impacts. They know their place. They know their community. Excuse me, I have got a bit of a frog in the throat. So this is a moment of flux, and I think there's a great potential for existing power relations to be disrupted and transformed in this moment. But it's also a time for communities around Australia to collaborate and share our learnings as they emerge. So before I talk about some of the transition stories I've been gathering, I want to tell you a little more about NED. Next slide. Thanks, Scott. It's the mission of the NED Foundation to support our collective movement from competition to cooperation. NED is a philanthropic foundation, and it supports people and organisations towards cultivating a life-enhancing, inclusive ethos. We seek to nurture our collective capacity for citizen involvement as expressed in democracy and cooperation at the levels of the individual, community and societies. And the header there I wrote was that, you know, the activities that NED funds are ones that are relational, practical, inspirational and ethical in nature. And I'm happy to give more information about NED and link people up to it at another point. Did I want to say anything else? Oh, yes. So it's part of NED's remit to undertake research into social development in Australia. This is work done to prepare and anticipate for better ways for them empowering change for the good of people and planet. So over the last 2 years, I've been fortunate to have undertaken a listening and learning project to better understand the characteristics of this particular sustainability transition. And my focus has been on community-based grassroots initiatives. Next one.
We didn't rehearse the slide switches. Sorry.
Yeah, sorry, everyone. We are happy to be transparent about our working together too, modelling a different world.
That's right.
Yeah. So case studies of transition, I think, are hugely important because they're grounded practical experiments in collective change. And I think they offer us a sense that an understanding of what's happening, what is the unfolding relational processes involved in this systemic change. Now, we chose to focus on transitioning energy systems. We're interested in climate change, but climate change, as many of you will know who've been activists, as I have for too many years, climate change is so abstract and it's very hard for people to get the impact of that in our day-to-day living. So we chose to focus on transitioning energy systems from fossil fuels to renewables because that felt to be a more measurable and inclusive transition project. This research investigates 3 community-led transitions, and the groups chose to participate because they wanted their stories and learnings to be shared with other communities. Overall, I've interviewed 32 people, and I'm very appreciative of the warm welcome I've received in these communities. And I'm also honoured when people share their personal stories with me. These people are all volunteers. Many of them have spent decades in service to their community and to their country to be the change and to inspire the change that they feel is the best for themselves. And a number of people come to this sort of work out of despair. From a theoretical perspective, grassroots niches are a source of a more radical, sustainable innovation. So we started with totally renewable Yakandanda, a tiny population, around 3,000 people with 1,189 dwellings. And so it was a perfect niche case study. Yakandanda, many of you may have heard of it because they are on the Australian Story program. There are a number of articles written about Yakandanda because they were such an early adopter of trying to bring renewable energy into their community. And their goal was 100% renewables by 2024, and they achieved 65%. And probably the remaining percentage wasn't possible because of hills and valleys. But when they started out, that was their passion and their goal. And I think the regional niches give us all a sense that, yes, this is possible. Now, we've started with a tiny one with Yakandanda, and then Phillip Island is a little bit bigger. It's an island population south of Melbourne on the Bass Strait, and their goal of being carbon neutral by 2030. They haven't yet achieved that, but they're exporting as much renewables as they can with the infrastructure between them and the mainland. And there's a very different, more middle-class community with a lot of holiday makers, so different challenges for them. And my third case study is an organisation called Sustainable Living Armidale, and that we made quite a big jump there with a population of around 29,000. And that community are living within a designated renewable energy zone. And that gave a lot of complexity to the community organisation. And I want to say that my work isn't complete yet. These case studies are still underway, particularly Phillip Island and Armidale. But I want to share now a couple of the insights that I have garnered from my rich conversations with these communities. The first one, to say also that my approach is appreciative, and I'm looking for emerging patterns in the ways each of these community organisations have been able to engage with the wider community. And, you know, I've asked questions like, how have they managed to nurture an environment where a collective willingness has grown so that people are saying yes to renewables in a context that was very critical and negative more widely in Australia? And what I really heard from each of these organisations, from the people in them, was that there was a recognition and a pride of the community-centred history in these towns, where residents had worked cooperatively beyond philosophical and political difference to create and solve problems for the benefit of the whole. So these are communities practiced at working cooperatively. And interestingly, all three communities were historically conservative or conservative political representation. So there was a very strong conservative dynamic within their communities. But two little examples. I've got Kathy McGowan there because people who participated in her 2013 campaign were so empowered to have a sense of, we can do this. And so that was very important. And then the story of the Yakandanda Petrol Company, Proprietary Limited, the community had 10 days, and that was in 2002, to put a bid up for the only petrol station in town, or the petrol station was going to be gone. So a small group of people said yes, they'd do that. And 20 years later, 50% of the profits from that organisation goes back into the community. And there was this real sense, I spoke to one of the co-founders of YCD Co, that it wasn't about the petrol station, it's all about the community and how are we going to sustain ourselves. Okay, thanks, Scott. Another enabler that I saw was that these communities understood the imperative of acknowledging and building strong interpersonal relationships over and above any transactional interests. Each group, I've got some of the images there of the many, many street stalls that these community groups held to give community a chance to talk about whatever the particular issue was. The bottom one, they're talking about renewable energy in Yakandanda very specifically. The top one, that's another little stall talking about sharing. It's the Making Menders and Sharers group in Armidale. But Each of these initiatives meant hours of talking, sharing ideas, and listening to the community. And that gave the time to build a vision that could be shared, that was understood, and also build a sense that was part of that, building the collective yes towards renewables, but other sustainability initiatives as well. As one of the informants said, SLA brings a long-term vision around regeneration and protection of environment. And they've really been acknowledged for the vision and for attracting vast amounts of community to public meetings, unusually for other issues. So I love this little example from Armidale. To me, it shows part of the adaptive and flexible approach that the community groups must have to stay dynamic and connected with their community. I really saw that each of these organisations were an example of an emergent approach to strategy. They weren't haphazard, but they learnt to tinker their approach in response to community feedback with all those market stalls. And they also could read the energy of the community. And this is an example of adaptive and responsive theories of change. It's a flexible stance that's both planned and responsive. And their approach integrated needs of the environment, such as this picture, the community, and also economic considerations. And such knowing, I feel, comes from deep listening to the community. As this one person said, what they've done really well is identifying the needs and priorities of the community. Early on, Totally Renewable Yakandanda told me how early on they realised that because of the polarisation in Australia around climate change, they actually couldn't use those words. It was too much of a distraction. So they said, it's not going to work if we're going to ostracise people because of using the word climate change. And then you get into the argument about whether it was human-made or whether science was valid, and on it went. So they decided, this is a quote from someone which I haven't got up there, we don't paint ourselves as activists. We paint ourselves as local people having a crack, right? It's much more difficult to target for the haters. Their stance sought to be polite and respectful, and they're interested in the long-term relationships. So it's only a little moment, and I'm pretty passionate and excited about what I heard and feel. I just want to acknowledge again just the contributions these people make. One little thing I didn't say, talking about the reputation of these groups, a number of people from Armidale said they decided to move to Armidale from other places after going to a Sustainable Living Armidale meeting. And it was a sense that, yeah, there's people who are prepared to work for change that I can join in this community. And I heard that across all of the three organisations. So I think that's probably enough for me now, Scott. I'm going to pass to you to give us a sense of the big picture around ecologically just transitions and why a learning network might be right for this moment in time.
Sounds good. Thanks, Sarah. I will talk more about these amazing projects, and hopefully we'll have more time to do that before the end of today's webinar too, when people have questions or want to share their own stories. So I think what I'm going to offer is much more abstract than what Sarah was just sharing. And this is a bit of an occupational hazard. I'm an anthropologist and I work as an academic. And it's a particular weird occupational hazard for an anthropologist because most of our work is grounded in everyday realities and lived experience and what's happening in people's lives. But there's a part of what I do and what some of us in this field do, which is about understanding and thinking about the much more abstract theories of the systems and the processes that we live in. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, because when we talk about systems change, I think it's really important for us to think about what are those systems and how might we try to change them. So I want to start really briefly by mentioning this amazing essay by Margaret Atwood that was published a little over 10 years ago. And from the headline, you basically get the story. It's not climate change, it's everything change. And what she writes about in this essay is how everything that we know and experience in, let's call it the West, in the affluent parts of the world, and in fact, in lots of other parts of the world, is tied up with the fossil fuel energy system. So it's not just our transport and the way that we generate electricity, it's also our food systems. We're hearing a lot more about that in the past few weeks with the impacts of the war of aggression on Iran and how that's potentially putting food supplies at risk because fertilizer is tied up with fossil fuels. As she goes on to look at how fossil fuels are connected with arts and entertainment, and I would extend that to say that it's also bound up with the way that we value consumption and the way that we try to satisfy our needs as humans. So it's everything change that we're looking at. Now, on one hand, that's really scary because sitting in the background, and you can see it in that image there, is probably the idea that if climate change continues as it's going, we're facing collapse and everything will change and it will be very unpleasant for a lot of us. At the same time, the fact that everything changes is just this beautiful nugget of hope to me, because we know that transformation will happen. It may not be the transformation we want, but we can also act and intervene in ways to try and make everything change in directions that are more fulfilling, more flourishing, more just and equitable. Okay, but how? So I'm gonna show you three conceptual models in the next maybe 4 minutes and then pose a couple of questions. The first of those models comes from a paper that was published in about 2022 by Tiffany Morrison, who is at one of the universities in Melbourne, and I forget which one. And what she and her co-authors have argued is that where we're at with the climate crisis, we're in a position where conventional interventions are not enough. We need radical change to happen if we're going to mitigate the worsening effects of climate change and have a hope of getting through it. But they also point out that radical doesn't mean the same thing for everybody. And so they've got this nice typology, this 6 layers, 6 different types of radical. And they contrast, for example, in this palliative category of radical, things like geoengineering, things like carbon capture and storage, unproven technologies that really seem designed to preserve everything else and just take the carbon out of the question. At the other end, they talk about deep radical transformations, the efforts to try and identify and then change the underlying root drivers of the problem. And in fact, the word radical comes from it has the same sense and the same background as root. So it's not just extreme or crazy, it's like at the root of a thing. Now, they also point out, and this I tend to align with them very well on this, that when we're talking about climate change, the root drivers of this problem are not just carbon emissions. That's a symptom. The root drivers are our economic and social system that's built on capitalism and materialism, built on asymmetrical power relations, where some people have power and can exploit the rest of us, and the way that we're locked into exploitative and extractive systems to try and produce what we need. So we're kind of stuck, we're trapped in this system. But if we can address the roots and make those deep changes happen, we have a possible way out. All right, so what does that look like? Here's another model for you. This is an extremely simplified model of what a social system might look like, but I find it really useful. So this is from Karen O'Brien and colleagues, and they call it the 3 spheres of transformation. The argument is that we have our practices, the day-to-day stuff that we do in the middle, in the darkest circle, and then a layer around that is the rules of the system. the structures, the rules, the guidance, the institutions that shape what we do. And then even bigger than that is what they call the personal. As an anthropologist, I question that because it's not just personal, I change it to purpose, right? This is the goals, the beliefs, the values, the whole way of seeing and being in the world that shapes what we can do. And part of their argument is lining up with, you might know Donella Meadows, the famous systems thinker who writes about leverage points, that if we can get involved and change the beliefs and values and goals, that's our deepest, most powerful leverage point. That's where we can really transform systems. So another layer to this is that what we do helps to reproduce that whole social system. And a healthy, functioning social system has reasonably good alignment between these three spheres. So there's room for variation, there's room for disagreements and differences. But if you get things too far out of whack, that's when you get into, potential for conflict, potential for really deep tensions, and potentially even systemic collapse. So transformation involves not just changing the practices we're doing and not just, the energy system or the economy, but really thinking at the political institutions, the rules that guide us and that we use to guide us, which is where, law and legal systems come in, but also the beliefs and the worldviews that shape those laws. So this is really the game for me when it comes to systems transformation, thinking across these layers. I'll show you one more model, and this one is very technical. There's a lot going on the screen here. The basic idea is that innovation starts out in niches. It starts out in these protected places, but it also happens in the context of an already existing social and material system. So you heard Sarah talking about these three amazing community projects. We could think of those as niches, right? They're local, they're small, they're doing their thing, but they all have to interact with this bigger system. In the energy system in Australia, for example, right? You've got regional grids, you've got major corporate players that have a role in this. You have huge amounts of infrastructure that are built in, and those local community projects have to interface with that somehow. Now, one of the things that happens with these niche innovations, with these kind of projects, is sometimes they can be absorbed into that dominant system, but sometimes they can be rejected by that dominant system. So this is a really hopeful looking diagram, and I'll talk in a minute about how this leads to transformation. But one of the things that isn't in this diagram is most of those small little red arrows are going to die out. They're going to get crushed by the dominant system. If they're different enough, if they're threatening enough, they will be stamped out. That makes the kind of local work extremely hard, extremely difficult. Now, at the same time, some of those niche initiatives can actually transform the bigger system, the dominant regime. And it's not just from the niches themselves, but also from, you can see up the top here where they have a landscape layer, the even bigger system, where you have pressure from that system sort of disturbing the regime, the socio-technical system, then you create openings. So energy is a great example of where this can happen. We currently have this situation, I mean, especially acute right now with not calling it an oil crisis, but also acknowledging that we have to change our energy systems so that we can try to mitigate the worst impacts of climate change. This creates openings. That stable regime of fossil fuel and corporate generation and distribution of energy is weakening. So we have an opportunity to make change. And this is where niche initiatives can push. Okay, so what? Three statements and then a couple of questions for you. One is that when we create these local alternatives outside of the dominant paradigm, that's amazing. But we also need to see how they can contribute to transforming larger systems, because a whole bunch of somewhat connected, mostly disconnected local initiatives are going to be great in local places, but that bigger system, that extractive and exploitative system, is likely to remain in place. That makes it harder for other people to start up similar initiatives. We can recognize that when we're transforming practical systems, so the way we actually do things in practice, we're also intersecting with how the rules might need to change and how our beliefs need to change. So we need to think bigger than the local initiative and think about how do we change the way we see the world and be in the world. Incredibly hard work. The politics of these things are really intense already. And yes, I'm asking you to do more. And when we do that, we can recognize it's political work for sure, and it's also cultural work. This is about changing the way we show up in the world and changing the way we understand humans' places in the world. So a couple of question provocations for you. One is, how do local transition initiatives actually connect with these deeper radical transformations already? So this is an area I would love to hear more about and love to explore is how are people experiencing that? How are people thinking about it? How are people strategizing about it? Are they? And where they are, what's working? So we can share it with more people. And then the other is just recognizing how do we actually balance this really difficult tension where we need to create opportunities for that cultural and political work. But we also need to address the urgent challenges of energy transitions. We need to get off fossil fuels. Does it really matter if we do that in ways that continue to extract and exploit? Yes, ultimately it does. Do we have time? I don't know. Okay, I'm going to stop now because we've run a bit over the time we planned on, and we are now going to hopefully open up for some conversation and discussion with you folks who are here.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Sarah and Scott, and everyone for your wonderful comments. Before we go into questions, I'd actually like to read a couple of the comments that we've received from folks who are kind of reinforcing or echoing or adding to what we've been talking about. So Carolyn Ems has said, and I'd like to read her whole point because I think this is exactly what we mentioned at the beginning. Many people in this email list have direct experience with the desecration of nature for a range of projects she's listed, and the Great Dividing Range is being industrialised. These developments have subjected critical habitats and wildlife to harm that we believe is irreversible. The transition is unjust to our regional communities, and I'm really disappointed if the truth about the sacrifice of our incredible wildlife is being overlooked just to accommodate renewables funded by wealthy corporations. I just want to say that to me, that encapsulates what many, many people are now very, very worried about. So we'll come back to that. And Bryn, I know from North Queensland, he said, the elephant in the room is that new technology depends on additional electricity generation like electric cars and AI. We've seen the reduction of energy consumption disappear from the agenda. People aren't interested in transitioning to a lower energy lifestyle. Consumption, lifestyle, these are big issues, and I'm particularly interested in that because I did my PhD on elements of sustainable consumption. And then finally, there was a comment from Ted Fensom, absolutely someone I deeply admire in his ongoing advocacy work. He says, we really, really need new separate, I added the reallys, new separate recognition of biodiversity loss from critical minerals and mining and renewables, from the other mega developments and new impacts. These issues aren't in the legislation. So I just wanted to share those comments. People know what's going on, and there's so much complexity in this debate about we have to transition to a better energy future. Yes, we do, but at what cost? So I think those comments wrap that up really nicely. And just very quickly, there was a question early on, Sarah Hausman, when you started chatting, Colleen asked, what about Bendigo, Sarah? Are you working there? Would you like to answer that question?
I can to say, no, I'm not. There are so many places, like there's wonderful case studies in New South Wales. I think Hay has had a lot written about it. If you look at Renew, they've got some really good case studies that have been happening for some years. So our project is fairly discrete. My role is very part-time. We have the potential of a fourth case study, which is looking at a community that's gone through like fire or flood. So the Northern Rivers is the area we're looking at the moment as a potential to understand what's happening in those spaces. So we're trying to go for contrast and just to build our understanding as much.
Excellent, thank you. And as Scott and Sarah have mentioned, one of the things we aim to do over the next 6 to 8 to 12 months is actually try to collate as many stories of the Just Transitions work people are doing so that we can showcase some of those stories. We know there's always going to be a lot more going on than anyone can ever keep up with. I have an interesting question from Manu. He or she says, I would like to raise the risk of creeping corporate concentration and power imbalances in the energy transition space. For example, Coles and Woolworths, who are responsible for significant harm to communities' health and food cultures. They're leading mass truck electrification, for example. Can either of you comment on the legal structures we can put in place to regulate and limit corporate concentration of energy markets? Any thoughts on that, Scott or Sarah? And it's okay if questions are thrown around that we don't know the answers to yet.
I
Sarah,
don't
you're
have
on mute.
I don't have a good answer. Maybe Sarah has a good answer. Just to say briefly that, yeah, like this is where Tiffany Morrison and friends pointing out that capitalism and materialism are a problem here. There's a massive power imbalance and it's getting bigger. So where we have, very influential people advocating for shareholder value, they're thinking of transitions as how do we perpetuate this system, which is fundamentally inherently unjust. And we do need to find ways to break that down. Sarah, what's the answer?
Well, I see someone's just popped up the community independence. I think, yes, Colin, community independence, having different voices, having these stories that give a wider community a sense of possibility that another narrative is possible, because I think the power of the monoculture, and Coles and Woolworths are part of it, but the structure that is our society, that it's unchangeable. If one little piece goes, everything's going to fall down. That isn't the case. We are very adaptable. So to me, this is why this sort of conversation is so important. We don't know, but I think collectively more understanding and sharing our knowledge together and finding a way of doing that is a really helpful, the only way forward I can see, I suppose, because there's no, unfortunately, magic wand. I wish there were. Yeah.
And if I could chime in as I'm a recovering lawyer, and I know we have other lawyers on the call today, but the thing to remember is law is just a social construct. We make it up every day. Can we regulate to control corporate power? Yes, we can do anything. But it's the tricky niches of how you make that change that matter. And obviously people know that because they've jumped in on independence and TEALS and other such stuff. But the one thing we learned from building and looking after NINA for a very long time is that there's so much diversity in what people are working on. If we could find the root causes of certain aspects and actually join forces occasionally, and one thing that I'm personally passionate about is increasing community-based decision-making based on nature-based understandings. And that links to the bioregional work that AELA does, because so much of what communities are responding to are forces from the outside coming in. And at the end of the day, that's because our legal system is built that way. And if anyone wants to join a future Earth Laws yarn about that, let us know. But all of these issues, large corporations moving into communities, inappropriate renewable developments in places, all of these issues are linked to how decisions are made in the Australian legal system. There is no silver bullet, there's no easy answer, but there's a lot of things on the bubble in places like Scotland where they have something called the Community Empowerment Act. Some of that's around local wealth building, which is wonderful, but I'm a little less interested in, but it's really important. What I'm really interested in is how do we have the structures that enable local people to listen to Mother Nature in that local bioregional ecosystem place and have the power to say, no, that's not suitable for here, whether it's Woolies, Coles, McDonald's, or a gigantic industrial solar something. So that's a root cause that I will be harping on about in these discussions. But I think it's something that we can all play with together. But back to Scott and Sarah. We've got about 3 minutes left. Would you perhaps like to wrap up even a little? We don't have any more questions, but we've got a lot of comments. Actually, if you want to wrap up and inspire people to join us for our next big yarn.
Yeah, I think there's so much we could keep on talking about with this. So I won't say any more, even though I'm dying to. What I will say is our vision going forward, I suppose, is threefold. One, as as Michelle mentioned earlier, is this idea of a publication next year where we can gather stories of what's happening on the ground. And I think in that process, just like my research, we start to see themes and we start to look at what people in this group and further in the ecology supporting us, we can support and empower and give care to. That's one thing, but also the webinars. We want to have other voices. We don't want just the Scott and Sarah show talking about energy transitions. We're really interested in other folks who have stories to share, and that we can bring different voices together to answer the question, talking about the legal, for example, talking about ecologies with respect for the fact that we're all finding our way. So I suppose I see this as a culture where we can learn to listen better together, because I think that is part of the transition Australian community needs to move into. Because if we can't work together, then how the hell do we work with more difficult places? So the webinars, we're inviting people to join us, and then we're going to have some online discussions. In about 3 weeks, we'll be setting a date. But that's to encourage any of you to come along and let's start talking through it. We thought once every 6 weeks, an hour sort of thing, maybe a wee bit more, but not onerous, because we know everyone else is doing the good work. That's my thought. Scott, anything to add?
No, love that. Like you said, would love to just keep having this conversation today with all these people, but we've decided an hour is enough for today. But that should be enticement to come and join us and continue this conversation and share your knowledge and your experiences so that we can all learn together. That's the real go here.
So fantastic. And we just had a question. I clicked on the link and I can't find how to join up. Please go all the way to the bottom of the page. We may even change it to go up to the front or the top, but please go to that link we've shared. So earthlaws.org.au/just transitions, or just go to the homepage of AELA and you'll find the Just Transitions link. Go to the bottom. There's a lovely form you can click on. Don't know if anyone's ever described a form as lovely before, but you can also write a little bit about your initiative, your organisation or your interests, and the lovely Sarah and Scott will be in touch, and I'll be chiming in with great enthusiasm and passion. And just while I am being enthusiastic, just a reminder that you can also just follow AELA by joining up to our mailing list and keeping an eye on the website. We do update the website with our events and our activities, and the EJT Network has its own webpage now, and good things will happen. So look, it's 1 minute away from the hour. We're having some lovely thank yous come through. Thank you all for joining us. We know, as we've said many times, everyone's out there doing the hard work. We really hope that this kind of network will help reinforce, bring people together, and even if it's just moral support, knowing you're not alone in your community, let's join up. And I cannot wait to get a couple of hundred of us arguing for the same kind of regulatory reform, because the nerd in me is saying, let's go. But Sarah Hausman, Scott Matter, love your work. Thank you so much for initiating this. Cannot wait to be doing more of this with you all. So yeah, thank you. Have a great day, everyone. Go and pat nature or breathe in her essence, and we will see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you.